The air in Saint Martin Parish, Louisiana, is not just air, it's a physical weight. On September 14, 2022, that weight felt heavier than usual, thick with the kind of oppressive humidity that clings to skin and settles deep in the lungs. In the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin, the largest river swamp in the United States, the silence was a living thing, broken only by the incessant, high-pitched hiss of a million insects and the gentle lapping of dark, tannin-stained water against the hull of a flat-bottomed boat. 17-year-old Devin and his friend Marcus, 18, cut the engine, letting their momentum carry them through a nearly invisible channel. Towering cypress trees, draped in funereal veils of Spanish moss, formed a dense canopy overhead, swallowing the midday sun and plunging the narrow bayou into a perpetual, emerald twilight. They were deep in territory where maps became suggestions and time seemed to lose its meaning. As the boat drifted, a new element intruded upon the swamp's natural perfume of wet earth and decay. It was a foul, complex odor, both cloyingly sweet and acridly sour, the unmistakable stench of advanced rot mixed with human waste. Marcus wrinkled his nose, his voice a tense whisper that barely disturbed the still air. "You smell that? Smells like something died in here. Real bad." Rounding a slow bend in the waterway, they saw its source. Perched precariously on rotting stilts over the murky water was a structure that defied the definition of a home. It appeared to be a haphazard collection of driftwood, rusted tin sheets, and weathered planks, fused together against the elements. No lights emanated from within, no sounds of life, save for a dense, buzzing cloud of black flies swarming around a single, grimy window pane, their frantic energy a stark contrast to the shack's profound stillness. Instinctively, Devin raised his phone, the modern impulse to document the bizarre overriding his unease. He aimed the camera, trying to frame the derelict scene against the backdrop of the oppressive green. But as his screen focused, he froze, his breath catching in his throat. Through the warped, filthy glass of the window, a face was looking out. It was shockingly pale, with wide, vacant eyes that seemed to stare at nothing, and a jaw that was visibly misshapen. It didn't react to the boat or the boys. It didn't blink. It simply existed in the window frame, a silent, haunting sentinel of the decay that surrounded it. A tremor ran through Devin's hand, his voice cracking as he lowered the phone. "Marcus," he stammered, his words choked with a sudden, primal fear. "Call your dad. Call the sheriff. Now." The first call from dispatch reached Detective Benoit Thibodeau as he was finishing his coffee at a diner just outside Breaux Bridge. The report was garbled, filtered through the static of a teenager's panic. Something about a shack in the basin, a face in the window, a smell of death. For Thibodeau, a 52-year-old Cajun with the swamp in his blood, such calls were often exaggerated tales of squatters or hunting accidents. But as his patrol boat sliced through the dark, brackish water, following the GPS coordinates relayed by Marcus's father, the air itself told him this was different. The stench hit them a quarter-mile out, a putrid wall of decay that clung to the humid air. When they finally laid eyes on the hovel, propped on decaying cypress stilts, it looked less like a structure and more like an open wound on the landscape. Thibodeau, his hand resting on his service weapon out of pure instinct, led two deputies onto the rickety porch, the wood groaning under their weight. The door was unlatched. Inside, the gloom was absolute, the only light filtering through grimy cracks, illuminating a scene of unimaginable squalor. The interior of the shack was a single, suffocating room. The floor was a treacherous landscape of filth, rags, and what appeared to be animal bones mixed with human waste. Huddled in one corner, on a mattress stained almost black, were three figures. An older woman, her face a mask of vacant terror, stared past them, her eyes unfocused. Beside her sat two younger people, a man and a woman in their 20s, their bodies contorted by visible. The sheer strangeness of the LeBlanc case quickly overwhelmed the resources of the Saint Martin Parish Sheriff's Office. Within 48 hours, Detective Thibodeau's small office had transformed into a multi-agency command center. The Louisiana State Police had dispatched its own investigators in a mobile crime lab, not to process a murder scene, but to meticulously catalog the artifacts of a life lived in complete isolation. Even the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico was consulted, not to hunt a predator, but to help build a psychological profile of the family's unseen architect, Silas LeBlanc. They needed to understand the mindset that could enforce such a horrifying reality. For Thibodeau, the influx of state and federal interest was both a relief and a burden. The case was no longer just a local tragedy whispered about in Bro Bridge. It was a national anomaly, and the pressure to find answers was mounting with every passing hour. Miles away, in a sterile, climate-controlled laboratory at Louisiana State University, Dr. Anya Sharma worked under the cold, white light of scientific inquiry. The blood samples from Marie, Caleb, and Elodie LeBlanc had arrived that morning, and she had immediately begun the process of DNA sequencing. As the initial data populated her screens, a deep professional quiet settled over her. She watched as strings of genetic code scrolled past, revealing patterns she had previously only seen in textbooks and academic papers on critically endangered species. The analysis showed an astonishingly high degree of homozygosity, long, continuous stretches of the genome where the genes inherited from the mother and father were identical. It was the unmistakable signature of extreme, multi-generational inbreeding. There was no ambiguity in the data. It was a biological confirmation of the horror Thibodeau had discovered, a story of a family tree that had collapsed in on itself. Back in St. Martinville, Detective Thibodeau found himself in a different kind of laboratory, the parish courthouse archives. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and decaying leather, a scent he usually found comforting. Today, it felt suffocating. He was hunting for the LeBlanc family's ghost, sifting through brittle, yellow documents that chronicled the parish's history. He found a single, solid lead, a property deed from 1925, transferring a 40-acre parcel deep in the Atchafalaya Basin to a man named Auguste LeBlanc. After that, the official trail went cold. No birth certificates, no tax records, no death certificates. It was as if the family had made a conscious decision to sever all ties with the outside world, to methodically erase themselves from the ledgers of modern society. They hadn't just been forgotten by the world, they had actively rejected it, pulling the swamp around them like a shroud. The most crucial and heartbreaking part of the investigation took place not in an office or a lab, but in a quiet room at a state-run medical facility. Thibodeau sat across from the survivors, his presence a stark intrusion into their shattered world. Caleb and Elodie huddled together on a small couch, their bodies still contorted, their eyes wide with a fear that seemed to have no specific source. They tracked his movements but offered no recognition, responding to his questions with only low, guttural sounds. Marie sat in a wheelchair by the window, utterly catatonic. Thibodeau tried speaking to her in the gentle Cajun French of his own grandparents, hoping a familiar dialect might penetrate the fog. "Madame LeBlanc," he said softly, "on est là pour vous aider." "We're here to help." There was no response. The silence in the room was absolute, a wall of trauma he could not breach. Later that week, Thibodeau and Dr. Sharma convened over a video call, their two vastly different worlds colliding on a single screen. Thibodeau, looking weary under the fluorescent lights of his office, laid out his findings. A single deed from a century ago and a wall of silence from the living victims. Dr. Sharma, poised in front of a whiteboard covered in genetic charts, presented her own conclusions. "Detective," she began, her voice steady but grave, "the DNA evidence is conclusive. We're not looking at a single instance of incest. The degree of genetic degradation suggests a closed breeding loop that has been maintained for, at minimum, 3 to 4 generations." The two pieces of the puzzle locked into place. Thibodeau's historical ghost and Sharma's genetic map told the same story. They weren't just investigating a case of neglect. They were exhuming the history of a self-made prison, one built a century ago and passed down as a terrible inheritance. Detective Thibodeau felt a new kind of urgency, a gnawing conviction that the full truth was still moldering in that shack. Armed with Dr. Sharma's preliminary genetic report, a cold, scientific confirmation of the horror he'd witnessed, he walked into the St. Martin Parish District Attorney's office. He needed a warrant, not for an arrest, but for a comprehensive forensic excavation of the LeBlanc property. D.A. John Guidry, a man whose career was built on prosecutable certainties, listened with a pained patience. "Ben, what's the charge here?" Guidry asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "Criminal neglect? Against whom? Silas LeBlanc is dead. You can't prosecute a ghost. And the survivors? They're victims, not perpetrators." Thibodeau argued that the shack itself was the primary witness, that it held the story of how this happened. But Guidry saw only legal quicksand. "We have no living suspect and no clear, ongoing crime. A judge will never sign off on turning that place upside down. It's a tragedy, son, not a case." Let the state handle them. Our part is done. Rebuffed by the legal system, Thibodeau pivoted, hoping the medical and social services apparatus could offer a different path to understanding. The survivors were now wards of the state, cocooned within the protective bureaucracy of the Louisiana Department of Health and the Department of Children and Family Services. He placed a call to the lead DCFS case manager, a woman named Susan Broussard, requesting access to the initial psychological evaluations of Marie, Caleb, and Elodie. Her response was polite but firm, a verbal stonewall. "Detective, with all due respect, my clients are not evidence. They are profoundly traumatized individuals," she explained, her voice devoid of compromise. "Our sole focus is their stabilization and recovery. Subjecting them to interviews about their past, for an investigation with no clear criminal endgame, would be contrary to their best interests and a violation of their privacy under HIPAA. They are finally safe. We cannot allow you to reopen their wounds for the sake of curiosity." Thibodeau felt a surge of frustration. The very system designed to protect the LeBlancs was now inadvertently shielding the secrets that had created their prison. Blocked by both the law and the state's protective agencies, Thibodeau decided to take a more direct approach. He would go back to the source. He assembled a small team, including a deputy with extensive knowledge of the basin's waterways, planning to return to the shack to conduct a more methodical survey, even if it wasn't the full forensic sweep he wanted. But the Atchafalaya itself seemed to rise up in defiance. As they prepared to launch their boat from a remote landing near Henderson, the sky turned a bruised purple-gray. A violent, late summer squall erupted with terrifying speed, transforming the placid bayou into a churning, chaotic torrent. The wind howled through the cypress trees, and sheets of rain reduced visibility to near zero. The deputy shook his head, shouting over the storm, "No way, detective, the channels will be impassable, and that shack could get washed right off its stilts." Forced to retreat, Thibodeau stood under the leaking awning of his truck, watching the deluge. The swamp that had hidden the LeBlancs for a century was now fighting to keep its secrets buried. The days following the storm were a study in frustration for Detective Thibodeau. The swamp, having violently asserted its dominance, had receded into a deceptive calm, leaving behind a trail of downed branches and newly impassable waterways. He was at a standstill, blocked by the law, by bureaucracy, and by nature itself. The shack remained the epicenter of the mystery, a sealed container of answers he was forbidden to open. It was during a late night, caffeine-fueled review of his sparse case file that a new idea sparked. He recalled a state police presentation on advanced crime scene documentation. He picked up his phone and made a call to a specialist unit in Baton Rouge, a team equipped with technology that could see what the human eye could not. He carefully framed his request not as a forensic search, but as a non-invasive structural survey to assess potential biohazards and instability, a plausible need, given the hovel's precarious state. It was a calculated gamble, a bending of protocol, but it was the only play he had left. The case was bizarre enough that the unit agreed, their professional curiosity piqued. 2 days later, a nondescript van from the Louisiana State Police Technical Services Unit arrived at the Henderson boat landing. Inside were 2 technicians and a piece of equipment that looked more suited for space exploration than a bayou investigation: a portable terrestrial laser scanner, or TLS. This device was designed to fire millions of laser points to create a hyper-accurate, 3-dimensional digital model of any environment, capturing every surface and object with millimeter precision. As their boat cut through the now calm water, the lead technician, a quiet man named Frank Dubois, explained the technology's power. "Think of it as a digital autopsy of the structure itself, detective," he said, his voice steady over the engine's drone. "Once we have the point cloud, we can peel back layers on the computer, look through walls, see what's hidden under debris, all without ever touching a thing. If there are any more secrets in that shack, we'll find them." For the first time in days, Thibodeau felt a surge of genuine hope. This wasn't just a new lead, it was a new way of seeing. The scanning process was an eerie, almost silent procedure. The team set up the TLS on a heavy tripod in the center of the shack's single, putrid room. The air was still heavy with the ghost of decay, but the atmosphere was one of detached, clinical focus. The device emitted a low, electronic hum as its head rotated with meticulous slowness, sweeping the entire interior with an invisible beam of light. It took nearly 2 hours, repositioning the scanner multiple times to capture the scene from every possible angle, ensuring there were no digital shadows. Thibodeau watched from the rickety porch, a silent observer to this strange technological ritual. He saw the same squalor he remembered, but now it was being transformed. It was no longer just a heartbreaking scene of human suffering, it was a massive, complex dataset. Every stain, every bone, every indecipherable scratch on the wall was being methodically catalogued, its exact position in space preserved forever in a cloud of digital points. The swamp had fought to keep its secrets, but technology was now meticulously pulling them into the light. Back inside the air-conditioned command van, the raw data was uploaded and processed. On a large, high-definition monitor, a ghostly, three-dimensional wireframe image of the shack's interior materialized. Frank navigated the model with the skill of a surgeon, rotating the view, zooming in with breathtaking clarity. "All right, detective, let's take a look," he said, his focus absolute. He began to digitally strip away the layers of filth and debris that littered the floor, revealing the rotted planks beneath. Nothing. He pivoted the model to examine the walls, a mosaic of grime and mold. Then Thibodeau leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Stop. Go back," he ordered, pointing to a section of the wall that had been obscured by the stained mattress. In the precise geometry of the laser scan, a faint but distinct rectangular outline was visible. Its edges were too straight, its corners too perfect to be the result of random decay. "There's a cavity," Frank confirmed, his fingers moving quickly across his keyboard, isolating the area. It was patched over with mud and wood pulp. "It's a deliberate concealment." This was it. The discovery of the hidden wall cavity was the key that would unlock the entire case. It provided Detective Thibodeau with the concrete, undeniable probable cause he had so desperately needed. This was no longer a speculative fishing expedition. It was the targeted investigation of a deliberate act of concealment within a scene of profound neglect and death. He immediately placed a call to District Attorney John Guidry, his voice steady but charged with an intensity he hadn't felt since the investigation began. "John, we found it. A hidden compartment sealed into the wall. I have the 3D scan data to prove it." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Guidry, the ultimate pragmatist, understood the legal calculus had just changed. A sealed compartment in a place like that wasn't for storing precious memories. "All right, Ben," the DA finally conceded, his voice now laced with a grim sense of finality. "You've got it. I'll get the warrant signed and sent over. Go find out what they were hiding." The institutional walls had finally come down. Thibodeau was going back in, and this time, he had the authority to tear the shack's oldest secret out into the open. The return to the shack was starkly different. Armed with a judicially signed warrant, Detective Thibodeau was no longer a curious observer but an authorized agent of intrusion. He led a small, purposeful team, including a deputy and a forensics technician, back across the dark water. The oppressive humidity and the stench of decay were familiar, but the atmosphere was now charged with the anticipation of discovery. Inside, the scene of squalor was unchanged, a frozen tableau of misery. Thibodeau didn't hesitate. He pointed directly to the section of the wall identified in the laser scan, the area that had been hidden behind the mattress. "There," he said, his voice flat. The deputy stepped forward with a pry bar, and the sharp, metallic sound of him chipping away at the hardened mud and pulp seal was a jarring violation of the profound silence. Each piece that fell away felt like a deliberate act of historical excavation, exposing a truth the swamp had held for a lifetime. As the makeshift patch crumbled, it revealed a dark, rectangular void within the wall. A puff of stale, musty air, smelling of dry rot and contained time, escaped the cavity. The forensics technician aimed a powerful flashlight into the opening, its beam cutting through decades of darkness to illuminate the shack's most deeply buried secret. There, nestled in the back of the small compartment, was a single bundle. It was a thick, rectangular object wrapped meticulously in what looked like waxed oilcloth and bound tightly with brittle twine, a desperate attempt to shield its contents from the insatiable humidity. Wearing nitrile gloves, Thibodeau reached in with a steady hand, his movements slow and deliberate. He gently grasped the package, feeling its solid, unexpected weight. Carefully, he withdrew it from its tomb, holding it in the dim, green-tinged light. It was a book, a thick, heavy ledger, preserved against all odds. On the rickety porch, which now served as a makeshift processing area, Thibodeau carefully unwrapped the ledger. The aged oilcloth was stiff and cracked, flaking away to reveal a warped leather cover. He opened it with surgical precision. The pages were yellow and fragile, the edges darkened by moisture, but the ink, though faded, held. The book was filled with a cramped, labored script, the handwriting of someone unaccustomed to the act of writing. It was a journal. Thibodeau leaned closer, his eyes tracing the first legible entry, his voice a low whisper as he read the words aloud to his deputy. October 1925. The world is a sickness. The flood will come not with water but with men. We will keep the blood pure here. God has given me this ground and this law. My seed will be my own. The focus of the investigation had just violently shifted. This was not a record of a family that had lost its way. It was the manifesto of a man who had created his own, a chilling testament written by the hand of Silas LeBlanc himself. The news of the journal's discovery did not remain a secret. In a multi-agency operation involving local, state, and forensic personnel, containing a revelation of this magnitude was impossible. The leak started as a whisper, a single, shocking detail passed from a deputy to a cousin who worked for a local news affiliate in Lafayette. Within hours, the whisper became a roar. The story exploded, first across Louisiana, then metastasizing into a national media firestorm. News vans with satellite dishes bristling from their roofs descended upon the small town of St. Martinville, their crews transforming the oak-lined square in front of the parish courthouse into a chaotic encampment. The name, LeBlanc, was suddenly on every network, the horrifying, half-understood details of their existence broadcast on a relentless loop. For Detective Thibodeau, the media frenzy was a violation. He had fought to maintain a degree of dignity for the survivors, but now their deeply personal tragedy was being consumed as public spectacle, their faces and misshapen bodies endlessly analyzed by pundits who had never set foot in a swamp. The story of the Atchafalaya swamp family, as the media quickly branded them, captured the public's morbid imagination and ignited a fierce, often ugly, national debate. Online forums and social media platforms became breeding grounds for wild speculation and armchair psychology. To most, Silas LeBlanc was a monster, a backwoods cult leader who had imprisoned and tortured his own family. But a darker, more insidious narrative also began to take root in the country's fringe corners. Anti-government extremists and radical isolationists began to warp Silas's paranoid writings, recasting him as a misunderstood patriarch fighting to protect his family from a corrupt modern world. Small, unsettling protests began to materialize outside the DCFS facility where the survivors were housed, some demanding justice for the family, others holding signs that read, "Leave them alone." The complex, human horror of the LeBlanc family's reality was being flattened into a grotesque political symbol, a proxy war for the nation's deepest cultural divisions. Thibodeau found himself spending late nights under the harsh fluorescent lights of his office, poring over photocopies of the journal's fragile pages. He felt a desperate need to understand the man who had authored this nightmare, to find the source of the poison. One passage, written in a spidery, almost unreadable script, stood out. "The world's sickness is in its mixed blood," Silas had written. "They weaken the line with their laws and their schools. Here, my blood remains my own. My law is the only law. God will see the purity of my work." It was the chilling, self-justifying core of his delusion, a belief system that had turned a family into a eugenics experiment. The journal revealed that this was not a curse, but a choice made by one man. If you've been following this story and believe this truth must be fully exposed, comment below with the phrase, "The swamp keeps no secrets." This sudden, intense national scrutiny sent shockwaves through the Louisiana state government. The very agencies that had once stonewalled Thibodeau were now in a state of frantic damage control. Governor John Bell Edwards' office issued a statement promising a full and transparent investigation into how the LeBlanc family could have remained invisible for so long. The Department of Children and Family Services and the Department of Health, once focused solely on the survivors' recovery, were now forced to launch internal reviews, facing accusations of systemic failure. District Attorney John Guidry, who had initially declared the case a tragedy without a crime, now found himself ambushed by reporters every time he walked to his car, pressed on whether he would pursue posthumous charges against Silas LeBlanc or even investigate potential criminal negligence on the part of state officials. The quiet, methodical investigation Thibodeau had envisioned was over. It had been replaced by a political firestorm, and the search for truth was now hopelessly entangled with the hunt for a scapegoat. The LSU genetics lab was a world away from the Atchafalaya, a sterile sanctuary of steel and glass where truth was measured in base pairs and chromosomal abnormalities. Detective Thibodeau stood before a large, wall-mounted screen, the cool, conditioned air a stark contrast to the oppressive humidity that still seemed to cling to his clothes. Dr. Anya Sharma stood beside him, her expression a mask of grim professionalism. On the screen, she had projected two images side by side. On the left was a complex, color-coded diagram that resembled a circuit board, the LeBlanc family's genetic map. On the right were the scanned, spidery writings from Silas LeBlanc's journal. We cross-referenced the names and approximate birth years mentioned in the journal with the genetic markers for lineage, she explained, her voice steady. What we found, it's a perfect, closed loop. The family tree isn't a tree, detective. It's a wreath. There are no outside branches after Auguste Leblanc in 1925. Not a single one. Using a laser pointer, Dr. Sharma began to trace the horrifying lineage. The red beam connected names from the journal to the genetic profiles, drawing undeniable lines between father and daughter, brother and sister, uncle and niece, generation after generation. Silas and Marie weren't just the parents of Caleb and Elodie, she stated, her voice dropping slightly. Genetically, they were also first cousins, once removed. And their own parents were siblings. The science was brutal and absolute. The diagram showed how recessive genes for debilitating conditions, normally rare, had become dominant, expressed with near certainty. The misshapen jaws, the twisted limbs, the cognitive voids, they were all there on the screen, predictable outcomes of a deliberate, four-generation experiment. It was the clinical, biological autopsy of a family that had systematically consumed itself, a scientific confirmation of a horror that defied simple language. The swamp hadn't cursed them, their own blood had been turned into a prison. As the devastating weight of the genetic map settled in the silent room, Thibodeau's eyes drifted to the journal entry on the right side of the screen. It was the last page, the ink faded, the handwriting frenzied and nearly illegible. "Zoom in on that last part," he said, his voice raspy. The text enlarged, filling the screen. He leaned in, reading the words aloud, each one landing like a physical blow. "The sickness of the world will drown in its own filth. But from our pure blood, a final seed. A child will be born of this sacred line who will not be broken but blessed. He will command the serpent and walk on the water of the basin. This is God's true covenant. This is my work." A cold, profound clarity washed over Thibodeau, eclipsing all the horror that had come before. This was never a story of isolation or neglect. It was a story of faith. It was a man-made apocalypse, a eugenics project driven by a divine, delusional prophecy. The curse wasn't an affliction, it was the entire point. The case of the LeBlanc family never resulted in a criminal trial. In a press conference held on the steps of the St. Martin Parish Courthouse, a somber district attorney John Guidry officially closed the investigation. He announced that no charges would be filed, declaring Marie, Caleb, and Elodie to be profound victims, legally incapable of forming criminal intent due to a lifetime of systematic abuse, isolation, and cognitive impairment. The architect of their suffering, Silas LeBlanc, was beyond the reach of the law. The decision sparked a firestorm of public debate, transforming a local tragedy into a national case study on systemic failure. State-level inquiries were launched into the Department of Children and Family Services, questioning how an entire family could exist for generations as ghosts within the system, completely uncounted and unseen. For Detective Thibodeau, the official closure felt hollow. Justice was not a legal ruling, but a concept that had died in that shack long before he ever arrived. For the survivors, the world was remade, not with understanding, but with sterile, quiet care. Marie, Caleb, and Elodie were placed in a specialized long-term state facility, a place of clean linens, structured meals, and windows that let in unfiltered sunlight. The transition was not a joyous awakening but a bewildering and often terrifying ordeal. Therapists and medical staff worked with painstaking patients, teaching them concepts as basic as using a fork or responding to their own names. There were no miraculous recoveries. The genetic and psychological damage was too deep, a legacy written into their very cells. They remained largely non-verbal, communicating through a shared language of gestures and sounds that only they understood, their bond the last remnant of their former life. They were safe, protected by the very state that had overlooked them for a century, but they would forever remain prisoners of a past they could neither comprehend nor escape. Their silent existence in a quiet garden was the final, heartbreaking chapter of Silas LeBlanc's work. The story of the Atchafalaya swamp family has since dissolved into the fabric of Louisiana folklore, a modern Gothic tale told to caution against the dangers of isolation and extremism. The shack itself was eventually dismantled by the state, its materials reclaimed by the swamp, leaving no physical trace of the century-long horror it contained. But the questions it raised continue to resonate, a stark reminder of the forgotten corners of the country and the vulnerable people who inhabit them. The tale of the LeBlancs is not one of a supernatural curse, but of a man-made one, forged from a monstrous ideology and allowed to fester in the shadows. It proves that the most terrifying prisons are not built of wood and tin, but of belief, and that the deepest darkness can be found not in the wild heart of a swamp, but in the twisted heart of a family. If the story of the LeBlanc family has moved you, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We believe these stories, no matter how difficult, must be told. Our next investigation, a case that will challenge everything you think you know about small-town secrets, is waiting for you on the screen right now. Click to watch. The truth is often more disturbing than fiction.